Hey, everybody. If you're listening to this, you are listening to the first free hour of this episode of The Shift with Doug McKenty. If you like what you're hearing, please consider subscribing to the show in order to access the full feature-length versions of the podcast, as well as have access to the members forum, where we discuss potential topics and interviews and dive deep into the overall concept of The Shift. For only $6 a month, not only do you get the full-length episodes, but also an opportunity to co-create with me, your host, Doug McKenty, the future of the show. Go to www.theshiftnow.com or patreon.com/theshift and sign up today in order to help make the shift possible. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Good morning, noon, or night, wherever and whenever you are listening to The Shift. I'm your host. My name is Doug McKenty. This episode was recorded on January 15th, 2022, and features American-born journalist Riley Waggaman, now based in Moscow. Riley has published his work in journals such as Anti-Empire and Russian Faith, and previously worked for Press TV, RT, and Russia Insider. He currently and consistently posts under the moniker Edward Slavsquat on a Substack blog of the same name. Though, given the typical government corporate narrative, you might fear Riley is a Russian or Iranian disinformation agent carefully implanted to influence the unwary American observer, a careful reading of his work clearly shows that nothing could be further from the truth. His insightful analysis from first-hand experience provide in-depth coverage from an unbiased point of view. Given that the heavy beat of war drums for Russia are once again sounding over the continuing conflict brewing in eastern Ukraine, Riley's insider interpretation becomes more poignant by the day. His nuanced perspective utilizes a sense of realpolitik that paints a comprehensive picture without falling prey to the idealizations often imposed by American media pundits and repeated ad nauseum throughout the mainstream and social media landscape. While some praise Vladimir Putin as an ardent Russian nationalist standing against the forces of Western imperialism and global corporate capital, and others vilify him as a vicious dictator with close ties to a powerful Russian oligarchy, Riley remains level-headed in his interpretation of events. His writings provide balanced analysis of the Russian landscape, along with the facts to back up his realistic assertions. Over the course of this interview, we will discuss a history of post-Soviet Russia that includes Putin's actions in the Ukraine, Crimea, and Syria that many will not have heard behind the wall of anti-Russian propaganda so prominent in the Western media today. Conversely, we will also take a deep dive into the Russian COVID response, including lockdowns, mandates, and dubious connections to the World Economic Forum that many hardcore Russophiles refuse to acknowledge. Stay tuned for this nuanced discussion concerning Russian history and current events, presenting an interpretation you will rarely find within online echo chambers or mainstream media outlets. Find out more about the work of Riley Waggaman at www.edwardslavsquat.substack.com. As always, find out more about The Shift, sign up for the newsletter, or subscribe for feature-length versions of the show at www.theshiftnow.com. Look for The Shift with Doug McKenty on Odyssey, Rockfin, and YouTube, or any of your favorite podcast hosting sites. Connect with me on Facebook at Doug McKenty, Twitter at DMcKenty, and I am also happy to announce the creation of my own blog, The Populist Papers, which is also on Substack. Without further ado, I'd like to thank journalist Riley Waggaman for agreeing to this interview, and thank you for helping to make the shift. Hey, everybody, and welcome to this 104th episode of The Shift. I'm your host, Doug McKenty. I'm happy to be joined today by Riley Waggaman. He is a Moscow-based American journalist. He's done some work for RT and other outlets, and I am really curious. He's been writing on his blog under the pseudonym Edward Slavsquat about what's going on with COVID in Russia. And I was actually disappointed to find out that it's so similar to what's happening here in the United States. I had heard that they had tried, for example, to push the QR code thing in Moscow, and that a lot of citizens of Moscow were really, against it, upset about it, a lot of pushback about it. And I was hoping that maybe Russia was an example of a government that wasn't going to be pushing these mandates as hard as apparently, according to Riley's work, they are. So we're going to have an in-depth conversation, a broader conversation about Russia and the U.S. in general, about Putin, uh, in general, and then we're going to focus in on some of the COVID news that's coming out of Russia today. So thank you so much, Riley, for coming on the show. Do you want to just let people know a little bit about your background and a little bit about what you've been writing on the blog recently?
Yeah, so I'm an American originally from Southern California, but I've lived all over the states, and I got my started my writing career, I guess if you can call it that, when I after college I worked in Washington D.C. as a political blogger slash journalist and did all sorts of bizarre gigs. Like I did movie reviews for the Washington Times and like just anything, to make ends meet. And I really just got disillusioned with the whole scene. I mean, I was young. I was like 22. It's such a cynical place, Washington D.C. I was like so disgusted with it. So I just packed up, moved to Central Europe. I was in Moravia, southern Czech Republic, for about a year, and just loafing, just being total waste of human life, basically. Doing nothing productive, but having a great time, like best time of my life, hands down. But then I was like, I gotta like do something. I just can't sit in Moravia and drink Pilsner all day. So
Right.
I moved I found a job teaching English in Bashkortostan, which is a republic in Russia. It's like right near the Ural region and actually close to Kazakhstan, which has been in the news recently. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, I taught English a bit in Bashkortostan, and then this was right around the time when Maidan started in Ukraine and the whole Ukraine crisis and Donbass, and it was a huge thing, and the reunification with Crimea. So I was in Russia for all that, and it was totally freaky. Uh, and it sort of got me interested in thinking about and writing about Russia because I was in Russia and people were talking about Russia, and I was like, wow, maybe I should do this.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up moving to Moscow and getting back into journalism. So I did a few gigs. I was with Iran's Press TV. I was their Moscow correspondent for a bit. I worked as a for RT International for their website for about 4 years, and I recently left that position, and I'm doing my blog. So, like you said, I'm just trying to talk about things that I think are really important that nobody seems to be talking about, at least in the English language. I haven't seen any coverage of what I'm discussing anywhere. So it's so interesting to me that no one's talking about this stuff.
Right. I mean, the news that we're getting in the US about what's going on with Russia, I guess I want to start. I think some people might be listening to this and hear that you've worked for RT and Press TV and go, well, clearly, you're some kind of a purveyor of Russian disinformation. What was your relationship working in journalism with those two outlets? Did you find I mean, people are going to say RT, of course, is state TV, state media, state-owned, state-run media, and they're pushing Russian propaganda. What do you feel like is, in terms of being a journalist, did you feel pressured or censored, or what was the perspective from those news outlets in terms of just trying to get, facts out or unbiased journalism, as opposed to the kind of news that you're seeing come out of the United States right now?
I mean, it's such a great question. And the reality is that when you work with these organizations, what you basically have to do to justify it is you're saying, I understand that I'm only going to be able to present a limited scope of perspective here. But I feel like the topics that are most important to me make it worth it. So at the time when I was working for Press TV, for example, Syria was a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Iran was really involved in Syria. And the way that I justified it was I personally think that Russia and Iran are on the right side in Syria, and I have no problem relaying their perspective to the English speaking world. And I was happy to lend my credibility to that. Now, is that journalism or activism? It's probably activism. It's probably activism if you want to be honest about it. But I don't think that anybody, if people are going to RT and Press TV and think that they're getting the unadulterated truth, I mean, guys, I don't know what to tell you. Like, that's just not how it works. I mean, that's just not how the media works. You're gonna have to say, okay, what do the Russians say? What do the Iranians say? What do these guys say? And just make up your own mind. And unfortunately, there's really not that many news sites anymore that you can go to where you're gonna get like a really, really cutthroat journalist who is just going to tear apart everyone.
Yeah.
It just doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I can't think of a single journalist who's doing that like on an international level. I don't know of one really. So yeah, I mean, it's a you could basically say I was a mercenary in some sense, and anybody who works for these organizations are. And it doesn't mean that they're bad people or they're liars. It just means it's yeah, you're not like going to be able to talk about human rights abuses in Iran if you're working for Press TV. It's like that's not how it
Right.
works. Yeah,
Well, one of the interesting things for me, I think, because especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I have found more and more that the difference between the United States and the journalism in the United States, and even the journalism, say, in communist China or in Russia or Iran, I mean, it's all infused with propaganda. I think Americans have this concept that their news that they're receiving here is somehow part of this free press, and
yeah,
that
yeah,
they're getting this unbiased perspective compared to, say, RT or press TV, where they're clearly, that's just Russian propaganda or this kind of state propaganda. And I just, especially since COVID, it's like, my God, people, can't we wake up and see that this, like you're talking about, like, where is there real journalism, objective journalism in the world today at any
right.
of these
Anywhere.
news sites?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So just to be clear too, I'm not, I'm just sort of almost like confessing, like I mean, I wouldn't 100% endorse any organization that I've ever worked for, really.
Hmm.
But yeah, if you're coming from their perspective, like, oh, it's RT, they're like so much more evil than CNN or whatever. I mean, that's just also not how it works. I mean, everybody's got their angles. I mean, CNN's probably pushing whatever, like their Pfizer press releases and weird stuff like that. So it's
Right.
you got to be careful. Like information is being used to manipulate you and mold you, and you should just be aware of that. And everybody's doing it. So.
Right. I mean, at least from my perspective here in the United States on RT, first of all, a lot of American journalists that work for RT here, I think they have a little bit of a broader scope of issues that they can tackle from different perspectives. Whereas at the American corporations, the corporate news, if you don't toe the line, then you're out. And then I've actually done some work, because RT is often considered to be quote unquote propaganda in terms of looking at primary source material and this and that. And I find that at least we're getting this different perspective, and the reporting is actually pretty decent. So it's important for people to, whenever you ingest any kind of media, to double check those sources and find out, with an understanding of what the bias is,
Yeah.
find out for yourself what you think is actually going on at the end of the day.
Well, and you know why that's also important is because it's always, so much of media today, it's not that people are lying, it's lies by omission, right? They just don't
Yeah.
tell you things. They're telling you the truth. They're just leaving out stuff that might change your mind, right? Or might make you realize that, okay, this is true, but this is a really complicated situation. I should think more deeply about this. So that's where and Press TV do have value, because are you going to like learn about, why Assad might not have so-called gassed his people like in on CNN? No, they're not going to
Right.
tell you the other side of that story. So I think it's a totally, this is valuable information that people should also weigh, and taking into account where it's coming from. Absolutely. So
Yeah, I mean, at that time that you're talking about, I mean, we can get into both Syria and Ukraine a little bit here, I think, to kind of get this broader picture. I actually thought, like, for example, when Russia came into Syria with the air support, that was a brilliant move, and that probably saved a lot of Syrian lives, because the US at the time, they were preparing. Obama had his red line. The US was preparing for full scale invasion. It would have been a complete disaster. And I remember thinking, despite the propaganda that I was getting from the American press here, that, like, wow, and we'll get, because as we discussed before the interview, this is a very nuanced conversation, but I actually thought, like, Putin really, this was a good thing, and I was happy to see that Putin kind of played that so strategically in support of the Syrian people in that instance. And I personally, after my um, I just find, from my point of view, that it's obvious, even though, gosh, it's amazing how much we hear about Assad, the evil dictator here.
Right.
He was pushing democracy in Syria from the time that he took over from his father, and then he actually held elections in the middle of it all. I think it was 2014 when they did establish a democratic constitution, and he did have elections, and he was elected as president, and they did have international observers, watching the election. It seemed pretty legit to me. So I feel like he's actually, despite what most Americans probably think, he's been a liberal reformer in Syria, and he's been unfairly attacked by the United States in terms of the way he's portrayed in the media here to justify a lot of the interventions in the Middle East that the U.S. has been engaged in. Do you want to talk about your perceptions with the whole Syria thing, and maybe talk about how you feel Putin handled that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say about it. I'm not an expert on Syria by any means, even though I was working for Press TV. But
Sure.
I mean, I was more, my time at Press TV was more about like the relationship between Iran and Moscow, like during the whole thing. So it's much more like this official talked to that official, they agreed to this, blah blah blah. But
Uh-huh.
what I would say about Syria, it's like I think no matter how you look at it, like how could you? I just feel like no matter how you look at it, the pragmatic solution was obviously to keep Assad in power, even if you don't like him for whatever reason. It's like it was literally Assad or fanatics, like
Right.
literally, and it would have been absolutely devastating. And I'm not saying that Russia and Iran, don't have blood on their hands. I'm sure that they've killed civilians. Like it's 100. I'm absolutely positive they have.
Mm,
But for one thing, I'm also sure that the United States has killed a lot of civilians in Syria, like probably a lot of them. And
right.
obviously, the U.S. backed. I mean, I think it's pretty much well documented now. I mean, you have the CIA and the Pentagon giving weapons to these freaks, and sending them into Syria and through Turkey. I mean, it was a huge thing. I mean, it was a total clusterfuck.
Right.
What I would say though is that while I think that Russia did the right thing, it wasn't for altruistic reasons. It was
Sure.
because Russia has very, very severe strategic interest in Syria. It has the Tartus naval base. It's its only access to the Mediterranean, really. And so, if you want to sort of juxtaposition Russia's actions in Syria, look at what they did in Libya. They did nothing. They let they let they basically let Libya fall to the same sort of scam, the same plot that Syria was being subjected to.
Sure.
So that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's not that Russia is like fighting for humanity and the greater good. It's like Russia has a line where they're like, okay, we really don't want Syria to fall because we have really, really we're invested in this country for a lot of reasons, and you can't take it. But if you're just like some random country, they're not going to care. They're not going to stop you.
Sure.
So that's important to keep in mind.
Well, and then let's touch upon the Crimea thing and the Ukraine thing, which is now heating up again. Because I remember kind of during that same time period, I mean, we saw clearly that the United States has been engaged in this color revolution in Ukraine, which I thought was subversive. And then, the western half or the eastern half of the Ukraine, excuse me, is all Russian speaking. The Ukraine has traditionally been part of Russia. So, I actually had compassion at the time for like, we're seeing, and of course, we've got the United States pushing NATO in the Ukraine and pushing NATO closer and closer to Russia, which was a promise that was made that they would not do. So, again, I just understand where Putin is coming from in terms of like, hey, you guys are pushing our boundaries here. Why, if I push back a little bit, or if I put troops here, or if, I think there was probably some aid going to Western Ukraine or Eastern Ukraine at the time from Russia. I'm not sure you could tell your perspective on that. But just to kind of see what you're framing as someone who was actually living in Moscow or living in Russia at the time, what was your perception of that whole situation?
Well, I mean, there was people were totally overjoyed when Crimea rejoined Russia because I mean it
Yeah.
was basically. I mean, it's historically Russian territory, ethnically Russian. I mean, it's just part of Russia. It just was and always has been, and that's just the reality that people are gonna have to accept. And I just don't understand why anyone would be like, oh no, it's like really Ukraine, even though nobody who lives there. I mean, okay, there's a minority of people who probably want to be part of Ukraine, but it's a minority, and so is this. Do we get to
Right.
have any democratic say in where we, what country we're part of? And of course, people will make these excuses, but I mean, come on, they're just nitpicking and being stupid. So I think that Crimea is just like not really even up for discussion. It's part of Russia. It's always been part of Russia.
Hmm.
I don't see the issue here.
And
The
they did.
situation, yeah,
Well, I just wanted to mention, because I looked into this as well. I mean, they did have an election there, and in the United States press, they tried to say, Russian forces were influencing the election, or somehow it was twisted or whatever. But 90%, or it was a huge number of people in the Crimea that voted to join Russia. And as you say, ethnically and historically, it's always been part of Russia. I just again feel like the dominant narrative that people are getting in the press about it, like Russia, invaded and took over this part of the
yeah,
country,
which is
is
ridiculous.
completely off
Yeah,
base. Yeah.
it's totally off base. And about the elections, that's like a whole. It's like a whole debate that's even still going on. Like, how legitimate was the referendum?
Uh-huh.
I don't know. This is what I would say. Like, Russian elections historically not that great, not
Sure.
that dependable. Just like in anywhere, just like in the United States. So
Yeah, exactly. I
that's not
mean,
a knock on any modern election. Is like I'm willing to be like, all right, I don't know, guys, but this is what I would say. Even if the numbers, the referendum wasn't legit, just go to Crimea and like talk to people. Like I have friends there, and they're like, why are people trying to pretend like Crimea is occupied territory? You can just walk down the street and ask anyone whether you want to be part of Russia and Ukraine. They'll be like, obviously, I want to be part of Russia. It's not even a question.
yeah.
Now, it gets more complicated because unfortunately, when they joined Russia, there's now all these sanctions. There's problems with banking. There's like a lot of it's tricky, and there's a lot of people who are like pretty pissed off because there's been economic problems for a number of reasons. But it's not necessarily Russia's fault for that, and people still, as far as I know, are still really happy being, rejoining Russia. So
Right.
that's Crimea for me. Uh, the situation in Donbass is a little bit more tricky, in my opinion. And I say that as someone I took 2 trips to Donetsk when I was working uh, as a journalist. I guess it was in 2015. So this was right after I believe the first Minsk like ceasefire agreement was signed or whatever they call it, if I remember correctly, like April 2015. And what I found so interesting about my visit there was that while it was clear to me that people in Donetsk and Donbass and that region were obviously didn't want, they opposed the regime in Kiev. They had been horribly abused by these, many of these guys who came in to Donbass were these, punitive battalions, these like far right sector guys with, like Nazi regalia, like on their, you know, uniforms and stuff. I mean,
Right.
really creepy guys. I mean, not
Right.
all of them, but some of them were. Some of them were real fanatics. All of that aside, they were like, we really feel abandoned. We feel like we're being used as this buffer between Russia and Ukraine. We didn't get the same sort of support and treatment that Crimea got, even though we're ethnically Russian. And the reality is, like, this might be like really controversial to say, but it's actually quite accurate. What ended up happening in Donbass is that you had a lot of really colorful, charismatic, very genuine rebel leaders, like in Donetsk and also Lugansk. Like the president Zakharchenko, right? That was his name. They were all
Mhm.
assassinated, and the reality is that people blame that on Kiev, but there's very very strong evidence to think that if Kiev was behind it, Moscow had full knowledge The reason being is because these guys were just out of control. They couldn't be controlled. They were too independent, and they wanted more dependable leaders in Donbass. And so the reason why that might sound crazy, but the current president of the Donetsk People's Republics, this guy Denis Pushilin, if I remember correctly, is basically this sort of United Russia apparatchik guy. So United Russia is like Putin's party, and he just got his membership card. And it's basically Moscow just making sure that there's no funny business. They have complete control over the situation. And when I was in there, when I was in Donbass, there was always these weird dudes in black following me around. Like you could tell the place was crawling with FSB like spooks, crawling with it.
Right.
And I'm not saying that there was like tons of Russian troops there, but it's clear that Moscow didn't want its presence to be really known, but also didn't want a fully independent Donbass, but also didn't want like any trouble, And so you can say pragmatically they're playing this really delicate game, but it really screwed over the people living in Donbass because they've been living in this horrible condition for what is it now, like 6 years, where they're not really a country. They don't really have any good trade relations with anyone. Just recently they were able to start exporting products directly to Russia. For years they weren't even allowed to do that. It's like very, very strange. And another thing I'll say about this, because I'm sort of getting off into weird tangents, but when I was in Donbass, I spoke to a Ukrainian journalist who was very, very pro Donbass, very, very pro, Donetsk People's Republic. And he told me something really interesting, which was that I guess it was in the summer, like when the whole conflict started, and there was these, basically when there was this little war that took place in East Ukraine, the Donbass forces had pushed their way to Mariupol, which is like this coastal like port city. They basically could have walked into this city and taken it. They pulled out, and the reason, this is what I was told by, I believe, a really reliable source, was that there's a very, very powerful oligarch in Ukraine, this guy named Rinat Akhmetov. And he has a lot of business dealings in this city. And if it had fallen to the rebels, or whatever you want to call them, I mean, whatever name you want to use, it would have basically been under sanctions. It wouldn't have been a legit place to do business. So basically, he said, I will pay pensions to all the pensioners in the Donetsk People's Republic if you pull out of Mariupol. And so he's basically bankrolling like the social services of Donbass to keep them out of his business, his port. And Renat Akhmetov lives in Kiev, or he did for a long time. And you can make the argument that the situation in Ukraine is basically it's an oligarch war,
Sure.
And there's a lot of shady oligarchs on both sides. So again, I'm sort of like getting onto these weird little tangents, but my point is, it's like, unfortunately, Ukraine is just like full of these really creepy oligarchs who do really creepy things, and it's not. I'm not saying that I like the regime in Kiev at all. I don't at all. But it's just, you just need to look at it with a little bit more nuance and realize that a lot of innocent people are suffering for no apparent reason. And like, theoretically, Russia could be doing a lot more, and they're just not.
Right.
So,
well, I mean, I think one, for sure, it's nuanced, and I don't think Americans are getting a lot of that nuanced information when they're making their decisions about what's going on there. And two, I think there is a lot of geopolitical and strategic. I mean, there's a lot of resources in Ukraine, right? And then we're talking about oil pipelines and natural gas pipelines that the U.S. is invested in, and Russia, is trying to get its resources into Europe. And so then you've got the oligarchs, I think, in Ukraine that are vying for a piece of this action. And then you've got this larger picture where the US and Russia are really fighting over resource control in terms of these fossil fuels that are going to, getting into the European market. The US wants to kind of stop that. And the US is pushing NATO farther eastward towards the Russian border, which is making Russia nervous. And so it's a way more complicated issue than people are really comprehending from my perspective here in the United States. I guess maybe you could kind of talk about that, because what I think ultimately is that I think that the U.S. is being the aggressor. I actually feel like when I do see that they've broken that promise about pushing NATO. I mean, from my point of view, once the Soviet Union fell, they should have disbanded NATO, and that should have been
Yeah,
the end of it all,
yeah,
right?
obviously, yeah.
And so it's like the fact that they're even keeping NATO going, trying to get the Ukraine into NATO, Turkey into NATO, expanding this whole thing and pushing it towards Russia's border. I mean, this is very aggressive. And this is when you see, Putin starting to move troops around and posturing in this way. But also, and the term realpolitik comes to mind, because I think this is where Putin fits in. I'm not trying to say that he's like a perfect guy by any means, but he's playing this larger strategic game. And I mean, really, at the end of the day, there's oligarchs in Russia and oligarchs in the United States that are probably really behind all of this too. Like, how much are the quote unquote democracies really fighting for the freedom of the people in the Ukraine
Right,
here?
right. So, okay, I think you're really on the right track. I really agree with everything you
Cool.
just said. To add to that, just to give my perspective on the time I've been here, um, you know, unfortunately, more and more, I have to admit this. When I look at the situation between the tensions between NATO and Russia, which I agree. I mean, objectively, you just have to say that NATO has been the aggressor. I mean, I don't see how you could not
Yeah,
admit.
right.
You just can't not admit that. That being said, the aggressor towards what? And that's where it gets a little bit more confusing because, you know, the way I see it personally, more and more, especially when COVID hit, was that these conflicts really aren't about like protecting, it's not necessarily the Russian government protecting the Russian people from NATO. It's like the extremely corrupt, entrenched elite in Russia who like control everything don't
Mm,
want to give their stuff the elite, corrupt, entrenched elite in the West.
right.
And it's just like it's just oligarch wars. It's just an oligarch tug of war, and these guys are just like sociopaths who just want everything, you know. And a lot of these guys, I mean, I really think that we're starting to see this more and more, and they're like pulling the curtain back. They're just showing they're not even trying to hide it anymore. Is that there are people in the world, powerful people in the world. I really truly believe this that have visions for what they want humanity to look like,
Right.
in 10 or 20 years. And in a way, this is just part of that same scam. It's like I'm a rich, powerful dude, and I want this, and I want to see this happen, and I don't care.
Yeah.
Like I just don't care about countries or nations or people. I want more, and I want my vision. And I'm not talking about people even necessarily sitting in a smoky room, plotting the destruction of humanity. It doesn't even have to get that conspiratorial. It's more just like
Right.
I have interests. Your interests interfere with my interests. This is just business. Who cares if we kill some, plebs? Like, let the serfs die. No one cares.
Right.
And so, for example, I read there's a really funny. I should pull this article up and send it to you. It's quite good. There was a recent political scientist here in Russia who was talking about the tensions in Ukraine, and he was like, "All right, if we're going to have a war in Ukraine, like, of course we agree. There's tensions with NATO. NATO's been very aggressive, but if we're going to have a war in Ukraine, let's create a special battalion made up of all the sons and daughters of Russia's richest oligarchs, and they go in first
Yeah.
wave,
Yeah.
and
Let's do that here too. Yeah.
let's see how quickly they sign that like ceasefire agreement or whatever, you
Right.
know? Because I mean that's really what we're talking about here. I mean, who's paying in blood and for what? Like, what does the average Russian really have to gain here? At a certain
Right.
point, I mean, that might sound scandalous to say, but I don't think it is. And the same goes for your average American who gets tricked
Exactly.
into grabbing a gun. And I think that more and more people need to realize, like, when you're talking about Russia and you want to say, like, I don't support NATO, I have solidarity with Russia, I really sympathize with that. But you should recognize that just because you don't like NATO doesn't necessarily mean you have to support the Russian government, because the Russian government in many ways is playing the same game.
Right.
So people just have to look at this not through such a narrow lens and just try to find like the humanity in it. Like what do I really support? What do I really want?
I want to, I mean, I absolutely agree with that, actually. I mean, I wish more and more people would just realize that, we, the people, here in the United States and we the people in Russia have way more in common, or we the people in Iran or Syria or any of these places, right? We have way more in common than we do, have these differences, and most of us don't really care. I mean, I remember hearing about that same time, that 2014, when the Syria thing was really heating up, that the people of Russia were, they were scared shitless, frankly, because they were thinking that there might be a US invasion. I mean, the propaganda here got so hot there for, 6 months that it was like, are we going to have a full-scale war with Russia? And why would we do that to the people of Russia? What is the point of all of this? We have to be looking at these larger um, the impulses of the oligarch class and why everyone is being manipulated into these certain directions. Did you,
Exactly.
as someone who was there at the time, I mean, were you feeling that heat? Was it like, my God, what's going on here?
Yeah. I mean, you it was so easy, I mean, to just get drawn into these, sort of vast narratives, where it's like, oh, we must like defend the, Crimea, and then of course it's on the American side, it's like we must defend Ukraine from the aggressors, and people just get so, and it's so easy to do, and I'm not criticizing anyone, but people get so invested in these overarching narratives that at the it on many levels just don't really correlate to anyone's best interest, unless you're like a oligarch, basically. Like
Right.
you don't have, no, in a lot of ways you just don't really have a horse in this race. And I would say, like, there are specific conditions where that's not the case. Like, I think that Crimeans definitely had a horse in this race, and in Donbass, I mean, of course, if you're going to have some crazy right winger with from Kiev, shooting up your neighborhood, like, that's not a guy on my team.
Right.
But a lot of people like getting like heavily invested in stuff where they should more be concerned with, like, we should just not be like, we just have to find a way to, not allow this never ending, like, you know, boxing match to continue, and like just get these people to chill out. So
Right.
I don't know. It's tough though. It's really tough. And obviously, I mean, I have tremendous sympathy with all the people in Donbass and Crimeans and with Americans too. I mean, think of all the poor Americans who have been duped into basically committing, like, going abroad and doing horrible things, and they were brainwashed.
Yeah.
It's really sad. Young kids. I mean, I know some of them. It's really
Right.
tragic. Then they come back to the States and they're all messed up, have PTSD, and blow their brains out. Like, we're just really we're hurting each other in such horrible ways.
Right.
Terrible.
Absolutely. it is so true. Every once in a while, you got to take a step back and be like, what is really going on here? How they can get the average person, I mean, we're all humans,
Yeah.
how they can get us to do these horrible things to each other, um, without, basically in service to these upper classes who are having these resource wars ultimately.
Yeah.
Um, I want to spend, the funny thing is, I feel like I'm actually kind of setting Putin up as a good guy for the framing, and then we're going to get into
No problem. No problem.
some of the more recent stuff, because and then try to create a more realistic view. But what is, I guess my perception is that after the fall of the Soviet Union and under Boris Yeltsin, the American corporate system just went into Russia and started raping. I mean, from my perception, the country for all those resources that were there, started making super money. And this is how I frame kind of the big picture with Russia, is that, during that time, it was a free for all. It was like the U.S. had won the Cold War, and they were reaping the spoils of the of the conquest, essentially. And then Putin steps in and he says, "You can't do this anymore. Sorry, guys." And granted, he probably ended up giving a lot of those resources to Russian oligarchs and creating this whole Russian oligarch system.
Right.
But uh, I guess, to kind of justify it, at least he was nationalistic about it. At least all that money wasn't going to the American oligarchs, that had been plundering the system at the time. And so what's the feeling about that? And then, I mean, how popular is Putin in the Soviet Union right now? And what's the feeling in the Soviet Union about, say, is Putin a dictator? Uh, does he crush opposition movements? Is there a lot of censorship, given this background context?
Well, just general. I mean, I would say, you know, I think that in many ways, I think that Putin has been a pretty pragmatic leader for Russia for many years. I mean, especially when he took over from Yeltsin. I mean, that being said, of course, like a rock could probably rule Russia better than Boris
Right. Yeah.
Yeltsin. but it's like at least a rock won't be like a deranged alcoholic. But um,
Yeah.
the thing though about Putin is, and I think that you probably I agree with sort of what you said in passing there was Putin did sort of clean up. He brought law and order back to Russia. In many ways, he restored sort of the Russian sense of, national pride and dignity, which of course is extremely valuable for any nation or people. The problem, though, is that, in my opinion, and I think that this is becoming increasingly obvious, is that the way this was done was not so much that return the resources and the wealth of Russia back to the people, but just find oligarchs who won't rape Russia as much. Like
Yeah. Right.
there's still a lot
Right.
of raping going on, but now it's a Russian, and they'll be a little bit nice about it. But for example, I mean, you have a guy like Anatoly Chubais, who he's like the godfather of Russian privatizations. He's like one of the worst oligarchs ever. Like maybe like when you think Russian oligarch, you should think Chubais. This guy he was Yeltsin's like chief of staff or something like that. And he's still in power. He's like best friends with Putin. And he
Mm.
runs all these companies that are state owned. He gets them, he like is giving them as gifts and runs them into the ground, steals people's pensions. I mean, he's a total criminal. And he's just allowed to run rampant. And actually, funny enough, he just gave this I just saw this Russian media report about how Chubais was like praising Bill Gates' latest book. Like, Bill Gates is a genius. I love Bill Gates. Like, it's really creepy,
Of
All these
course.
guys,
Yeah. Yeah.
I just don't trust them. But so it's really, again, you just need a lot of nuance with Putin. And maybe maybe we should transition into COVID stuff. But unfortunately,
Yeah.
Putin hasn't been that great when it comes to COVID. And it's sad because if Putin was the guy that people think he is, this would have been such an amazing opportunity for him to dunk so hard on like the West. He
Right.
had so many opportunities to be like, I'm not going to commit economic suicide. I'm not going to lock my people down. I'm not going to treat them like dirt. But that didn't happen actually.
Yeah.
So
I was so disappointed. There was a part of me, because I understand the nuance, I understand the real politic, and so I'm always pretty pessimistic about, guys like Putin or guys like Trump, and when they're saying
right,
they're
right,
fighting the system, and so many people, here in the United States on the right will get on the bandwagon and be like, yeah, these guys are going to make the change that we've been looking for, and then it's like, no,
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 they're not. Um, but
yeah,
I do want to make the transition into the COVID thing, because I know that's been what you're working on currently. But I want to touch in on this Trump Putin thing, because it's so much of the perception that surrounds the way most Americans see it now, because we got so much. And I don't even know. I mean, I looked into the Russian disinformation, campaign, and the Trump Putin collusion to steal the election, and none of that. I mean, that to me was just a phenomenal American propaganda campaign against the American
Oh,
people. Like they were just pushing this narrative that they had almost zero evidence from the beginning could ever have been a reality. And then ultimately, after like years of being hammered with this and, congressional investigations that cost millions and millions of dollars, and they came up with nothing. And it was just like, my God, but people still, I think, cling, especially if they're, in their mind, a Trump supporter, then they want to set Putin up as this good guy and they're fighting against this propaganda. But then, it just gets into this whole left right paradigm battle in the United States where the liberals hate Putin and push sanctions against Russia. And the conservatives, no, Putin's our guy. He was with Trump. All I wanted actually out of that whole thing was because I supported Trump's notion that we should just have peace with Russia. Like, what's going on here? And I was actually kind of blown away by the media response. That was no, Putin's this evil, bad person who stole the election and all this. And it was like, that's where I see the American oligarchs coming in, pissed at Putin for taking their honeypot after the Cold War, and then just, hammering him to try to get all that access back, but a lot of Americans are sucking it up. And then it's funny because then you either have the Americans that hate Putin or the Americans that love Putin based on their political identity. And the nuance of the conversation that we're trying to have here today is completely lost. You never get to this place with it.
I mean, I think you knocked it out of the park. I almost have nothing to add to that. But what I would say, two quick things. So if you're someone who doesn't like the fact that Trump just wanted to talk with Putin, like that's insane.
Right? I know.
Then why even have a government? Like, let's just kill each other. Like, let's just literally start shooting missiles at each other.
I know.
It doesn't make any sense. Okay, not only is it insane, but these same people will be like, it's so nice and pragmatic that Barack Obama went to Saudi Arabia and met with like the Sultan who like executes wizards, like it's like, give me a break. Like I'm not gonna defend Russia's human rights record, which is not amazing, but it's definitely better than Saudi Arabia. Like, just stop being stupid and just
the hypocrisy is so self-evident. Yeah.
So this idea that U.S. foreign policy is hostile to Russia for humane or moral reasons is so ridiculous and laughable that it's just hard to take people seriously. Like, I don't like Putin because like he's bad on freedom of the press. Every single government is bad on freedom of the press, even the United States.
Yeah. I wish more people would see that.
Like, of course it's bad, but it's not the reason. So what is the reason? It's not that. So stop pretending it is. On the other side, like you pointed out, there are people who worship at the feet of Putin and think he's like this amazing, like, sort of bulwark of conservatism and, like anti-wokeism and blah, blah, blah. Guys, I don't know what to tell you, but like, that's not the case. This is not, I'm sorry to say it. Like we can get it. It's a whole other conversation. Like we could talk for several hours about it, but Russia is not like, it's a socially conservative country that has, I guess, what you would call traditional values. And I know that that's appealing to a lot of conservatives and that's fine. But the reality is that like, it's not as, it's not as amazing and cool and conservative as you think.
Yeah.
And like, there's a lot of censorship here. There's actually a lot of PC stuff. Like, for example, if you're one of these people who are like, I like Putin because he's really good on immigration and like, he's not afraid of saying when like an immigrant does a bad thing or whatever. There's a lot of these Putin guys who will say that. In Russia, they have this whole thing where it's like you'll have people coming in from Central Asia and they might be like accused of a crime, and the media will be told by the government not to even report their nationality. So it's like the same stuff like anywhere else. So if that's like your thing, where it's like, oh, like I like Putin because he's so anti-woke and isn't afraid to like talk about these issues or whatever. It's not even my stuff, but it's just not true. And there's a lot of reasons to be like, Putin is just a normal dude. He's not that special. So anyway, I mean, that's like a whole other convo, but
right. Yeah. I mean, interesting too that like we're having this cancel culture here in the United States because again, so many Americans feel like, we have this free press and or this free society, although hopefully that's getting eroded in the last, and now we can get more into the COVID stuff because we're clearly seeing not just the cancel culture around political correctness, but then, anyone that disagrees with the dominant COVID narrative is getting hammered and censored and silenced as well. So I hope if anything comes out of this conversation, actually, I hope my listeners kind of realize. I think that the or I want to call it the Soviet Union still. It's funny. The Russia and America are probably pretty similar in
They're
terms
really
of
similar.
yeah,
They're really
yeah,
similar. I've
right.
lived in a few different countries, and Russia's really similar to the United States.
That
It
is
really
so
is.
funny to hear. I mean, that is
Yeah.
really amazing.
Yeah.
Um, Well, so why don't we get into the COVID thing? Because I was telling you before the interview, I think I was actually like I started reading your stuff, and then I was just I almost I almost got I was pretty disappointed, frankly. Like I had hopes because from what I had heard, Putin probably was standing up against, I mean, at least they had their own vaccine, the Sputnik vaccine, and they weren't pushing the big pharma vaccines. But then in your work, we're seeing all this, correlation, and they're actually working together behind the scenes. I had heard that. They tried to do the Vax passport thing in Moscow with the QR codes and all the mandates, and so many citizens just didn't go out then, wouldn't shop at the stores, that the store owners had to be like telling the government to stop doing this because it was crushing their businesses. And so I was hoping that there was enough popular sentiment there that these kind of mandates, and I think even like in your work, initially they tried to roll out the vaccines, and really there wasn't a lot of people that were taking it voluntarily. Like, I mean, the
Exactly.
Russian, I think probably the Russian people, if I was to point out a difference between Russians and Americans, I think the Russians have a more a healthy skepticism of the government than the Americans do.
Totally.
Americans
Totally.
tend to be so naive. Like, you don't
Totally.
think the government's,
It's
pulling all
lying
these
to you.
shenanigans? Yeah, yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah.
totally. It's 100% correct. I think you're totally right on that one. Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, look, guys. I mean, the COVID stuff in Russia is so fascinating, and you can go down so many bizarre rabbit holes.
Yeah,
But if you really want the 5-minute summary, um, the situation in Russia is basically nobody here people are overwhelmingly against getting Sputnik. There are other vaccines, but they're almost never used. So they're not worth talking about.
uh-huh.
They're overwhelmingly against getting Sputnik. I mean, if it's a voluntary choice, most Russians don't want it. That's just the reality. We have the data. There's just no denying it. An enormous majority of Russians do not want these QR codes, which I often refer to as cattle tags. It's
Yeah,
like something. Even state media opinion polls done by RIA Novosti or whatever show it's like 70%. But there are polls with more than 1 million respondents online that show it's upwards to 91%.
wow,
91 with like
wow.
1.4 million votes. 91% said no. What's disappointing about the situation in Russia is that if you're going to have any country on earth that is that's better positioned to say no to the COVID madness, it's Russia.
Yeah,
And any government that did it would be like the most revered, respected, worshipped government in Russian history. I mean, Putin could declare himself emperor for life tomorrow if he just came out and said, "We're not doing anything with the vaccines. If you want to take it, whatever. We're never going to do the stupid cattle tags. We're not closing down your shop. We're not harassing anyone. Deal with it." He would
yeah,
be like, there'd be no touching him. He could do whatever he wants. He could just start randomly shooting people in the street and no one would care. Just totally untouchable. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is the exact opposite has happened. So starting in June 2021, Moscow, the city, was the first to roll out a compulsory vaccination policy, which it's not for the whole city, but for certain industries. Like if you work in certain kinds of businesses, 60% of the workforce in that business had to be vaccinated. And then about a week, 2 weeks after that, they introduced QR codes for restaurants, which was such a disaster. And as you mentioned, Russians basically just boycotted restaurants. They just didn't go to them. And 2 weeks later, about 2.5 weeks later, 200 businesses had gone out of business in the city, which is like
Wow.
devastating.
Yeah.
And they were forced to cancel the QR codes because an election, a state Duma election, was coming up. Parliamentary elections were coming up in September, and we were talking about a situation that was so incendiary that even with Russia's not very good history of elections, they were probably thinking like, we can't even rig this if we keep this up. Like, there's no way to pretend that people will
Right.
support us.
Yeah.
If we don't cancel this, there's no way to fake it. There's no way to fake this one.
Right.
So they canceled it. And then what's really interesting is right after the Duma elections, which were unfortunately a little bit suspicious, they 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 introduced compulsory vaccination across Russia. Every single region in Russia has it now, and many parts of Russia now have QR codes. And it was
Wow.
introduced right after the election. So right after
Right.
the Russians go to the polls, they don't get to vote for another 5 years. And now they're pushing all the stuff that nobody wants. And the Russian government knows that nobody wants it. And they did it after the election. So the
Classic.
question is why? Why did they do that? And unfortunately, and this is just the facts, you don't have to, I mean, if you don't believe me, I can send you the links. I'm open to discussing anything I say. Vladimir Putin is on the record saying that he supports the introduction of QR codes at the national level. So right now they're discussing legislation in the state Duma. So regions, specific regions and cities have introduced QR codes. So for example, in St. Petersburg, incredibly, they have a very, very strict QR code system that's being used for almost all businesses in that city right now, which is incredible. I mean, it's horrifying. And in other parts, like in Kazan, they have them. Many other parts of Russia are using these cattle tags. And so right now, the state Duma at the national level, the national parliament, is working on legislation to make them basically mandatory for all regions of Russia. And this legislation has been postponed. It was supposed to be passed actually last month. It was supposed to be passed recently. They keep pushing it back. But Putin is on the record. He says he wants it. He's
Mm-hmm.
like, it should be done in a humane way to keep people safe. But yeah, we should definitely do it. Another thing about Putin is that he's done this really, really cynical game where he basically plays good cop, bad cop. So, for example, with compulsory vaccination, on multiple occasions he says, I'm personally against compulsory vaccination. And then the regions, specific regions, will pass these compulsory legislation decrees, and the Kremlin will issue a press release being like, "Oh yeah, this is great! Like, great job, guys! Like, keep it up." And so what he does is that he just distances himself from all the bad. You know, he doesn't want to be directly connected to all the bad. He'll
Right.
just say, "Personally, I'm against it, but if regions want to do it, that's their choice." Is it really their choice? I don't think so. I think that there's
Right.
a lot of pressure from the federal. They're just making the regions play bad cop. Kremlin is good cop, region is bad cop. So I think we're seeing the same thing in some ways with the QR code. They might end up doing it at the regional level, and Putin being like, well, you know, it should be done in a humane way, and then the regions do it, and blah blah blah. Who knows? But another thing about Putin is that not only does he support the vaccination of children, which is unthinkable in my opinion, especially, I mean, we can get into the specifics of Sputnik. It's not what people think.
Yeah.
Not only does it support the vaccination of teenagers, like between 12 and 17, which has started recently in Russia, he wants to vaccinate children as young as 2 years old. As young as 2. That's just totally unacceptable. This is totally like it's unfathomable how any semi-sane person would want to do that. So he's just not good on these issues at all. And when he does say something that people like point to and say, "Oh, look, like he doesn't like compulsory vaccination," he's just lying to you. He's just playing this cynical game where he says, "I'm personally against it, even though it's happening all over my country, and I'm the president. I'm not going to take responsibility for it." It's like, does he have any personal responsibility for what happens in his own country? Like, will people like when in the United States, people are happy to hold Biden accountable for like policies, even when even when it's not even his direct fault. They're like, look at what Biden has done, blah blah blah. Putin is the head of the Russian Federation. People should be like, what is this guy doing? Like, why isn't he taking a stand against this stuff? He's doing the exact opposite of what people think he's doing.
Right.
He's playing a very, very cynical game here, and a lot of Russians are very, very unhappy.
If you are listening to this, you are listening to the first free hour of The Shift with Doug McKenty. For access to the full feature-length versions of the podcast, go to www.theshiftnow.com and subscribe for the audio version for just $6 a month. Access the full-length episodes in video form through rockfin.com by subscribing at the Shift with Doug McKenty landing page. For $9.99 a month, you gain access not only to The Shift, but also all other premium content material hosted on the platform. Find out more at www.theshiftnow.com/store. Detoxify your body, decolonize your mind, make the shift. Well,
Totally agree.
right on, Riley. I really appreciate it. Actually, I've been following this stuff for years about Russia and what was going on in Syria and what was what's going on in the Ukraine and I haven't really put together an interview like this one that could have this kind of conversation about all that history. So I really appreciate you coming on and appreciate the work that you're doing. And appreciate that you've got the depth of perspective to be able to really see this from a lot of different angles and still get the big picture out of it. So,
well, I had a great time talking. I hope we do it again. Honestly,
yeah,
it's really great.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'd love to have you back for sure. Do you want to tell people about where they should go to find out more information about your stuff, your work?
So I'm on Substack. It's Edward Slav Squat. This is Edward and then Slav Squat .substack.com. If you want, I'm not on Facebook, but you can add me on Twitter. I mean, I'm not like big on social media, but please, I would love to have you as a follower, obviously. And my email is publicly available on my Substack. I usually respond to anything I get on Twitter. I'm totally open. If you have questions for me or concerns or want more information about something I said, please feel free to reach out to me. I usually try to respond to anything that I think is like good faith. So
cool. And what's your Twitter handle?
Oh, it's just my name, Riley Waggaman. So RILEY WAGGAMAN.
All right. Well, sounds good, Riley. Thanks a lot. Thanks again for coming on the show. I'll let people know that they've been listening to The Shift, and I'm your host, Doug McKenty, and you can find my stuff at www.theshiftnow.com. I am on Facebook. My personal page does better than my podcast page, I think, for algorithmic reasons, but so you can just look me up at Doug McKenty. And The Shift with Doug McKenty. I'm on YouTube, putting more and more stuff up on Odyssey and Rockfin these days, censorship-free platforms. And I'm at D McKenty on Twitter. So thanks everybody for checking this one out. And we'll see you again next week. Thanks again, Riley, for coming on. You have a great day.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. Take care. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. That was my interview with American-born journalist Riley Waggaman, now based in Russia. I was happy to have that interview basically handed to me by my friend Captain Wardrobe. I think he was episode 103. And I'm just able to finally talk to a Russian insider that could really give a nuanced perspective about what's going on in Russia, especially right now, as the mainstream narrative is continuing to push this whole thing in Ukraine. And I just find it amazing from my perspective that since Putin took over around 2000, he really started to nationalize Russian resources, and yes, the oligarchs came in, but from my interpretation, the Western corporations that were profiting wildly after the end of the Cold War from all the resource extraction that was going on in Russia, they've been very upset with Putin ever since then. He took a lot of profits out of the hands of the American oligarchs, and that's why consistently and constantly we're hearing all this anti-Russian propaganda here in the United States. But as Riley points out, the conversation is way more nuanced than that. Putin has done a lot to at least keep, even though sure there's an oligarch class in Russia, at least the Russians are in charge of all those resources, all that profit's not just getting funneled out of the country. And he's done a lot of things in terms of foreign policy that I actually think are quite positive. We talked about the Ukraine. We talked about what was really going on in Crimea, which has just historically been a part of Russia. And the Crimean people really wanted to be a part of Russia. And so what we consistently hear in the United States about how Putin invaded, I mean, it's really not an accurate depiction of what's been going on and what happened in Ukraine, where NATO and American allies, participated in a coup in the Ukraine because their leader was a little bit leaning towards doing more trading with Russia. And of course, the United States wants to see Ukraine in NATO and buying American-made weapons and supplying Europe and the United States with those resources from the Ukraine. So again, the conversation is just really nuanced. What's really going on in Ukraine? Is it American imperialism inching closer and closer to Russia being the aggressors in the conflict, which frankly is what I perceive? Even though we're constantly bombarded with how Putin is amassing troops at the border, and we're going to go into he wants to invade and take over half of the Ukraine for Russia. The conversation, again, just a lot more nuanced. So Riley and Riley's work kind of really dives into this and explains a lot of this. What happened in Syria when the U.S. was, Obama's red line, ready to invade. Putin comes in and says, hey, we'll help out, provide air support, and help fight the terrorism that's taking over in Syria there. And I think that intervention probably saved, tens of thousands of Syrian lives, if not more, that would have been the result of a full-scale American invasion. So there have been some good things that Putin has done. Now, conversely, especially around the COVID issue, where a lot of Americans, pro-Putin Americans, will argue that Putin is fighting the New World Order, and he's been working against the World Economic Forum, and he's not going to impose these mandates, and we're not going to see the COVID vaccinations and the mandates and the lockdowns and all of that like we're seeing in Europe and in the United States. Well, Riley also provides an alternative to that, and he shows how, well, actually, there are these oligarchs that are in control to a great extent in Russia, that Putin, does have this side of him that cozies up to these people, and they are working closely with the World Economic Forum, and, this whole mandate thing is getting rolled out there just like it is around as much of the rest of the world as they can possibly make it happen here, as we see this whole technocratic Great Reset rolling out basically worldwide at this point. So I just really appreciated having this conversation and turning you guys on to his work, because I think he'll continue to give this American perspective, but from inside Russia, that's a lot more nuanced, that shows both sides of Putin, and that has this overall analysis of what's going on between Russia and the West that's a little more realistic than just the black and white that we're seeing so often here in the American press, for sure. I've come across this quote, and I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of starting to write my blog, because I get frustrated when we get boiled down in arguments, and I think social media really it creates this division and this simplistic argumentative style that lacks so much nuance, and a lot of this lack of nuance comes out in this Russian conversation. And I think the quote that I've been coming across was, I think it was a film director, and he said, the lack of nuance is basically the characteristic of a tyrannical society. Once we make things so black and white that we're no longer having these nuanced conversations with respect for people on both sides of the issue, but also, listening to each other and paying attention to the minutia of an argument, that is where people really should be, have the critical thinking skills necessary to make your own choice about the issue. I mean, we need to just kind of settle down, get off the social media, start reading some of these journalists and bloggers who are really going into detail about the nuances of these conversations that we need to be having. I think our society can move forward in a good way. This division that has become replete. Almost every issue, it's turning into a pretty big deal for me. It's one of the reasons why I started writing my blog at the Populist Papers, to try to just be like, come on, people. Let's stop doing this. We're arguing very simplistically from both sides, black and white thinking, very unhealthy. Let's get into the nuance of each situation. Let's really learn how to use our critical thinking skills. Let's have respect for each other. And this is the only way that we can move forward in unity with numbers, with political power against the technocrats as they're moving forward, like Riley said, basically all over the world, in the United States, in Russia. The World Economic Forum has its tentacles everywhere. So if we're going to fight back against this, we need to learn these lessons. So I just want to thank Riley for coming on the show and having this conversation specifically about Russia, the last 20 years or so of recent Russian history, and providing this more nuanced perspective of Putin that's much less black and white that so many of us want it to be, and just so to give us a reason to stop digging our heels in so much, listening to the other side and realizing the truth is always, some kind of blend between the two, and at least really learning to use our own critical thinking skills in this more nuanced fashion to make our own choices about what's going on in the world. So again, thanks to Riley for coming on. You can find out more about the work of Riley Waggaman at www.edwardslavsquat.substack.com, and he'll continue his analysis in terms of what's going on with Ukraine. I'm sure he'll be covering that extensively, and he really has been on top of the whole COVID situation just to show that, Russians are fed up with this kind of government control, but the World Economic Forum has its way, and they're in the thick of it just like the rest of us are. So you can check that out again, www.edwardslavsquat.substack.com. And so thanks everybody for listening. Next week I'm going to have education activist Lynn Straw Davenport on. I've already got that one recorded. It'll be coming out very shortly. And we'll be talking about education and the applications, the need to empower local communities in terms of making education decisions in the face of, certainly what's coming down the pike in terms of the social emotional learning, really getting into our kids' psychologies, which Lynn finds very dangerous, and of course all the blockchain data collection that's coming down in order to facilitate all of that by collecting massive amounts of data on our children and basically turning them into commodities for this impact investment scheme that we're also seeing implemented as we speak. So you can go to www.theshiftnow.com, find all my work there, subscribe to the newsletter. Think about subscribing, $6 a month for the feature-length versions of the episode. And also, I'm announcing my new blog, my personal blog, thepopulistpapers.substack.com, where I'm going to continue to try to fight this left-right divide, although I'm becoming more and more adamant about my own libertarianism. The first essay that I've written is a three-part essay, and it's utilizing this conflict between Alison McDowell and Derek Brose to really tear into the left-right paradigm and talk about how I think libertarianism really is very accepting of all of these collectivist lifestyles as long as they're voluntary. I mean, this is kind of the thing that's frustrating for me, is that I see the left-right divide where it's preventing people from really getting together. The libertarians just aren't in conflict, but the more progressive-minded that people are, the more they just want to fight any kind of solutions that are talking about real freedom that may allow people to engage in what are traditionally considered free market solutions. So hopefully we'll be able to keep plodding forward. And I appreciate that all of you certainly listening to this are working on making the shift and hopefully working towards unifying the cause in terms of the technocratic resistance so that we can really develop that kind of political power that we need to overcome what these upper classes are clearly seeking to impose, this system of real serious total control that if it happens, it's going to be really difficult to change. So thanks again for listening, and I'll see you all again next week. Take care.